Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar, Get Started on the Journey to Unified Talent Management, presented by Aptitude Research Partners and Cornerstone OnDemand. I'm Dawn Presentine, Senior Marketing Strategist at Cornerstone, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Before we begin, let's go over a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a copy of the recording within 24 to 48 hours of today's session. If you'd like to ask a question, you may do so at any time using the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion, which will take place during the last 5 to 10 minutes of the webinar. If you experience any technical issues, please message me in the chat, and I will do my best to assist you. Now let's begin the webinar. Molly Lombardi and Steve Dabrowski will be your presenters today, so I'm going to hand it over to Molly to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Dawn. I'm really happy to be here with you and with Steve today. We've been doing some research on how organizations are using tools and technology and strategy to meet their talent challenges, and this look at particularly at the government sector should be very interesting today. My background is I'm the CEO and co-founder of Aptitude Research Partners, where we focus on primary research to understand how HR practices and technology help organizations achieve business results. So I've been studying this space for most of my career, and I'm pleased to share some of this new research we've done looking at talent challenges, and particularly for the government sector with you today. I'm joined by Steve Dabrowski from Cornerstone. And Steve, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, Molly. I must say, I'll give you props. You nailed the name. Well done. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Steve Dabrowski. I work with Cornerstone, and I've been here for a number of years. But prior to coming to Cornerstone, I worked in the federal government in the Treasury Department. I was a director of talent management for the shared service component within Treasury. And then I also was head of the leadership and learning and succession planning at the Internal Revenue Service for just shy of 2 years, and then came to Cornerstone, where I help agencies, organizations identify their talent needs and help them through some of the obstacles. And one of them is getting started down that path of unified talent management, hence our webinar.
Yeah, and Steve, I'll definitely be leaning on you today to bring some of that real perspective from being in the trenches there. But we'll start with some of the data and start our conversation there.
Perfect.
So when we looked at overall the human capital management challenges for all organizations, but particularly on this slide for government employers, retention is really where it's at right now. People are realizing there's low unemployment. There's still some concern about employee engagement and the market for top talent. So really focusing on retaining people is really the key thing that people are focused on. I mean, hiring from outside is always important, developing new leaders, safe and non-discriminatory workplace. These all round out the top four. But this idea of really having an understanding of how you sort of grow with your talent, I think, is really one of the key drivers we're seeing across all industries, but in the government sector in particular as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that organizations start asking themselves questions like, how do I attract and keep top talent, given that we're competing in a pretty tight labor market, regardless if we're talking public sector or private sector, it's very tight. How do I increase my employee efficiency with limited budgets, right? So we're seeing funding going down for agencies. How do we mobilize our talent? How do we retain them and keep them in our organization? You know, and not only that, once they're here, how do I make sure that I have the bench strength that I need in order to plug any gaps in capabilities that may arrive in the future? And then also, work is changing. So how are we addressing the future changing of the skills that are needed in order to do the work?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting time where organizations are thinking about how do we get people to join us for their career, but knowing they may have different jobs kind of within that career with us. And when we look across all organizations, we actually see that when it comes to organizations that have the lowest levels of turnover, below industry average turnover for their industries, they're 50% more likely to use a unified talent management solution. So they're taking this holistic view, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what a unified talent management solution means, because we like to play buzzword bingo sometimes in HR, but we'll talk a little bit about what that really means for organizations. But it's that idea of, as Steve said, growing with with your employees and being able to plan for what does the organization need going forward, and does that fit, and how does that fit with the development of individuals as well. So when we talk about unified talent management solutions, what do we really mean? Well, it's multi-layered when you think about what it means. It starts, of course, with your strategy around human capital. And every organization has a point of view on talent and human capital. They have practices and policies, but at the core of it, it's, what do we need to accomplish? And obviously, retention is at the core of that for a lot of organizations. But especially when there's sort of tight times economically, you need to have that point of view on how you want to treat people. And that informs your processes, how you onboard people, how you hire them, how you develop them, and how you career plan with them. Then you have technology as well, which is helping to support those processes, make them more efficient and effective. But it's not enough for them to just be efficient and effective. They also need to deliver an experience that's engaging, because it's, we've all seen the, great tools that have a, terrible user interface, and you don't want to use them as much anymore. So even if they're effective, if they're not delivering the experience, they aren't really getting across the point that organizations have. Yeah.
Molly, it's really interesting. I think this is so very, very true, that you have to start with the strategy, work your way through process, technology, and experience. What I would say from my experience is not everyone starts. A lot of people do not start with that HCM strategy, human capital strategy. Instead, what they do is they have their process, they bring in a tool, and they want to automate that process without ever asking themselves, does that make sense for me and my organization and my users in the overall big picture, right? So we can't get into this business of just automating processes and bringing in technology and think that it's going to solve. We have to start with that strategy. And when we bump into roads about the technology or the processes, we always fall back to what are we trying to accomplish in our strategy. So one feeds into the other.
And I think so many people don't necessarily get to buy technology, they inherit it when it comes to human capital leaders. So when that happens, how do you say, even if I'm in a set of constrained circumstances where I may not be able to invest in technology or all the technology I want or all the processes that I need to fix right away, where do I at least start with the things that I can control now based on that strategy and make it a journey that you're on?
Or inherit, buy, or build. I've seen some really horrendous Microsoft Excel spreadsheets trying to do something that shouldn't be doing.
I'm convinced there's a ball of duct tape and an Excel spreadsheet in the center of the universe. That's a discussion for another time. But yeah, so it really is, how do you take your strategy and translate it through all these pieces that you may have, bought, built, or inherited, and really deliver that experience is going to keep people with you long term and keep them productive as well. And the reason this is so important, particularly in the public sector, there's so many different job types that when you talk about government, right? There's so many different types of jobs, often a distributed workforce. You have multiple locations across geography, across the state, across the city. There's an external mandate for transparency and consistency. You are utilizing public resources, and so how do you make sure there's transparency and fairness, and for employees and for your constituents, the people who are funding public sector. And there's tough competition for top talent, and so there's a lot of different reasons that people may choose public sector careers. And so how do we tap into that sort of mission-driven piece, as well as being competitive employers from a development and an experience point of view as well? And really, so what it comes down to is, when we talk about this unified talent management journey, I'm going to sort of break it down into the classic, who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who is impacted? What do you need to do to make this a reality? When and where do you use talent data and processes? And sort of the why and the how. How do you measure it and make it a reality for your organization today? So let's start with who. When it comes down to who, it's really about the users. And users, there's multiple different types of users, but when I was thinking about user experience from a human capital perspective, I went back and looked at user experience from a software perspective. And it's a sort of a science within the software development community of how you create technology that is practical, experiential, meaningful, and valuable. It has a perception of utility, ease of use, and efficiency. It's an experience that's dynamic over time. And that sounds an awful lot like what human capital management and HR should be, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Yeah, and so how do we bring that idea into how we think about that strategy, processes, technology, and experience we were talking about?
And when we're talking about human capital management strategy and talent management overall, one of the things that I think to keep at the front of your mind while you're doing this is to make sure that you're not only just looking at it from one user's experience point of view. Typically, people that are helping purchase technology and systems are the ones that are going to be running it and administering it. So that's one point of view that we need to consider, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead on the slide. Thank you very much.
No, it's a perfect segue.
So in this, what I always say is you have to take into account the different points of view, right? The employees are going to have a different point of view, and they need different things from your talent management system capabilities. And I'd also even argue that employees might be separated from employees and supervisors, because I think that's another distinct use case for talent management. Then you go into admins, which I've seen in the past are typically the drivers behind the talent management. And their opinions are important, and we want to do things that reduce their workload and make things easier on them, but they're not the only point of view. And then finally, how are we going to support our other executives across the organization? How are we going to put the information they need into their hands? How long does it take us to hire? What are we doing to find better talent? How are we delivering training for our folks and making them feel the love once they become part of our organization? Remember, back to that retaining top talent. These all become factors in our decisions on how we deploy and how we maintain effective talent management.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And it's how do you get these to move in parallel? Because you do have to meet all these different needs. The admins have an important role. The business leaders and managers and employees all have very important roles to play, but very different experiences with technology. Think about performance management, for example. The senior management wants to be looking at trends across the organization. The admins want to make sure they have everything done in a compliant way, and they have the records and information in a compliant way. Managers are needing the education and prompting and coaching to help them have great conversations. Employees want to get that 5 out of 5 so they can move up the ladder. So people have very different experiences and uses. And I think but when it comes down to all of these different use cases, it's how do you use the concepts of simplifying, personalizing, and communication to deliver that experience for each of those groups. So we've learned in our research that simplifying technology is one of the biggest things to get people to use it. You can have the most elegant tool in the world, the most elegant software solution, but if it's not usable, if it's not being adopted, if people don't feel like it's simple and fits into the flow of their work on a daily basis, they're just not going to be able to use it, or not be willing to use it. And personalizing it, again, this sort of speaks to that experience. I need a system and a process that knows I'm an employee or an admin and delivers me the information I need at the point when I need it. And communication around all these experiences, helping managers and employees have better conversations, helping leaders and sort of direct their managers to move the organization forward. So bringing these three concepts together to make sure you're designing the user experiences for all those different groups that you need to be managing.
I think simplify probably is the overarching and all of it. No matter what you do, it must be simple to use or people aren't going to use it. The other thing I would say about personalize is, while I was at Treasury in the Shared Service Center, I offered, I own the LMS for the organization, and I provided the content through a third-party vendor. And my misguided offer of I was being effective that I tried to offer and say, hey, here's what I'm doing. This is working. So I made everyone have access to 20,000 different titles within this content provider. But I didn't shape it. I didn't give any personal. My utilization rate was way low. I think it's that concept of finding what works for the individual organization and the users, and then targeting it towards that. And then finally, in communicate, there's a quote that her name was Adina Friedman, I think. She was the CEO of NASDAQ. She said, ideas are only as good as your ability to communicate them. So making sure that you're actually putting it in a manner that is going to be consumed by your audience, whether that's back to admin, business leaders, managers, employees, making sure that we're targeting that message and that system for what they need.
Yeah, and it really comes down to, the reason we're doing this is to be able to execute on our goals as an organization. So we're facing all these different challenges from a technical perspective, from a retention perspective. And so when we think about how organizations, and those of you who are listening on the phone, the challenges you're facing, one of the things we did in parallel with preparing this webinar and the research report that we wrote was also to create a workbook to help you sort of think through some of these challenges and how you can apply some of the things we're sharing today. So as we go through, we're going to be covering some of the questions that are in this workbook, our handbook. It'll be sent to you, as Dawn mentioned, with the recording and with the paper after this call. But the first thing that we started with in the handbook is, sit down and think about what are your big challenges. What are the biggest challenges you have, whether it's around retention, and specifically is it certain departments or certain types of skills? Do you have the data you even need to understand the scope of the challenge? You might have a gut sense of where the problems are, but you may or may not have the data. Or do you have the tools in place to even track your progress against that challenge? So really thinking about what are those big sort of pieces that you're going to go after that have business meaning and that you're going to be able to get support for to be able to start this journey for unified talent management.
I think one of the biggest things that I could say to people when we're starting down this path, my key advice would be you don't have to do this alone, right? So I think the very first thing that you should accomplish is reaching out and building your team, right? Establish your project team. No matter what happens in terms of talent management, you're going to need the assistance, internal stakeholders that are going to help you because when we start to talk about talent management, there's very few business processes that impact as many folks across the board as talent management. So making sure that we're reaching out to our sponsors, our influencers, our key decision makers, our early adopters, to make sure that we're effective in getting that early buy-in, to support, and to be quite frank, divide some of the labor up, right? Divide some of the work up. And then the first question I think you should ask is, what key business problems are we trying to solve? And I used to call this the burning platform. What is your burning platform? What's keeping you up at night? What are you trying to solve for, right? And then build the plan to understand your scope, get your arms around what it is you're actually trying to accomplish, and how are you going to know you're successful against this challenge?
Absolutely. That's another great segue into sort of some of the what of unified talent management. Because when I think about what you're trying to accomplish, exactly to your point, Steve, it's about enabling the business, is a business goal that you're trying to achieve. And I love this example of when you think about what unified talent management, what sort of a system and technology should do, it should be seamless in support of where the business is headed. So if you've ever been in a road race and there's people who are helping out on the route, and they're offering Gatorade or water or energy gels, and different people have different needs at different points in the race, but they don't want to break stride to get what they need. So this idea of HR being the person that can deliver the information or the insight in the moment of need in stride with where the business is going. And the only way to know that, to your point, is to make sure you have that input. But really the goal is to sort of seamlessly and frictionlessly provide that data, provide that process in a way that can be executed in the flow of business.
Maybe this is the right time where we try to break it down a little bit and talk about kind of, since we mentioned pain points and what are you trying to solve, let's go through this and talk about this for a little bit. So when we talk about recruiting and onboarding, and if we don't do this well or together or seamless, as Molly mentioned, some of the things that an organization might experience because of that is their speed of hire is greatly reduced. Sometimes with manual or disconnected processes, making sure that we're not able to source or track or onboard the candidates in a timely manner, leading to turnover, right? So that would be one big pain point that I would see for recruiting and onboarding.
And I think when you don't have that communication, no matter how long it takes, if the person doesn't end up working out, huge opportunity cost as well. Exactly.
But then when you start looking at stuff like performance, because if we're talking about unified talent management, we're talking about it all, and it's got to be seamless, right? If you have a siloed performance management system or spreadsheet, you spent time completing manual forms, trying to keep down all the approvals or where we are with that. We become really inefficient and really ineffective, and we're compounding our frustration with performance management Because let's be honest, performance management is not everyone's favorite thing to do. What we want to do is make it seamless and easy for folks to do it and have it tied to other things like, for example, learning. When we talk about learning and the pain points there, if you don't have a system to do this and use this and deliver it, you're increasing your travel cost. You might have a slot of training rooms. Sometimes they're used, sometimes they're not. You have a lot of training resources, including instructors or vendors coming in to present, all because you don't have an automatic learning solution that's going to deliver training and development to your folks and make them feel the love from your organization. And then finally, just one other one, something that often gets overlooked is succession management. It's becoming critical in the federal government and in state and local government as well. And I think it's not even limited to the government. Very few people are coming out of college and going into public service. In fact, there's a study that said last year, 2016, said about only 2% of the folks that are graduating from college are making the decision to come into public service. First off, how are you going to be part of the group that those 2% people actually come to, and how are you going to retain them once they are here? So, succession planning becomes critical. How are we grooming our folks and developing the bench strength? And by not doing it, you're really causing pain for yourself down the road.
Yeah, and I think so much of it comes down to that communication and visibility on both sides. You want the leaders of an organization to be able to see into their talent pool and understand who they have and what skills they have, and to your point, be able to draw up those succession plans that are going to meet the organization's need and challenge and grow employees, but also have employees that can see what are the other opportunities here within the organization. How do you make going into public service an opportunity to gain insights and experience or have a career path that you couldn't have anywhere else, because there's some unique opportunities. And so I think I couldn't agree more. It's really important to help people understand not only that it's a holistic process, but it's really a holistic picture of the person's relationship with the organization is what it comes down to. And obviously the tools really can help enable that, but you have to have that strategy and that point of view around talent, or the tools can't help you. And there's a lot of talk about the digitization of HR, and people say, what does that mean? And I use this really simple example of the difference between automation and digitization. So if automation is sort of making more efficient a process, but it's basically the same kind of process. Like think about your calendar, right? I used to have a Filofax and a date runner, and we would write down our calendars, and then they went online. So there were some automated tools you could do recurring meetings and things like that, but it was really an automated version of something that you already had in an offline world. But now we have things like these digital assistants, where when you say something, there can be a dialogue, and it's sort of, again, in flow and in context. So if you cancel your squash game, maybe you want to change your alarm time in the morning. If you have a training class, you want to make sure that the approval goes to your manager, and that if you need backup fill, that you make sure that that person is scheduled. So it's this idea of putting it into context as well, making sure that you're thinking about the whole person as well as the whole organization, not just so-and-so needs to go to a class today. Human beings don't experience work in silos, but we have siloed human capital for so long, and now finally we're able to use the technology to catch up with how humans experience work on a regular basis.
When we talk about building that business case, I think this is an important point here. This idea of falling back to, we're talking about building our business case. You're going to have to come up with what we call the elevator speech, right? So you get in the elevator with your top leader, going up on the floor level, ground floor level, and then taking up to the fifth floor with him or her. You have 2 minutes to tell your story about this. You have to develop your message, right? So you can't, if that person asks you, why are we doing this talent management thing? What answer are you going to give, right? Go back to that, what business problems are we trying to solve? And the answer is not, we're automating our performance management process. No, what we want to say is stuff like, we want to save time in the performance management process. We want to capture higher quality information on development needs to improve skills. We want to implement a sound succession management process to increase our pipeline. Implement a pay for performance program on making sure that our folks feel that they're rewarded appropriately. Yeah. Come into that with the story that you want to tell and why we're doing what we're doing. Much more effective.
I always say nobody wants to buy HR technology. They want to run their businesses and their programs, but
Yep.
they get to buy HR technology along the way. They're lucky enough that they
Mm-hmm.
they get to do that. So I think, you know, absolutely tying it to that business case, I think, is really important. And, you know, we talked a little bit about how you know, how technology can help, and obviously there are challenges when it comes to implementing technology as well. You know, getting standardization, this can be particularly difficult in the public sector, where you may have had technology purchased under different, you know, grants and different sources of funding, so there may or may not be, you know, complete solutions in place, and you're sort of piecing things together, and standardizing processes. There's so many different roles and locations potentially within a public sector organization. So, you know, standardization is key. Integration of data and processes, and again, getting that user adoption, all of which is made easier when you have that common business goal in mind, because then it's about achieving that business goal, not about sub-optimizing one of these pieces of the puzzle.
Just a quick point about the standardization, and I think where I've seen people be most successful when implementing a talent management solution is they come into this being open to change, right? So this idea of standardization is great because we do have some things that are standard. You know, I always think of like OPM standard form, right? Nothing tells you that it's going to be the same like standard form, right? But even if it's the same form or same process, each organization is going to interpret those regulations and those things differently. So even if we are talking standardization, there still needs to be some flexibility in order to be truly successful with the talent management initiative based on what your organization needs and its tolerance for change.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. People mistake standardization for everything being identical, but really it's sort of the outcomes and the make sure it's fair and transparent, and that the outcomes are you know, in line. But you're right. There's always some localization, if you will, in different parts of the organization. But it's about understanding what's really important about what's important to be standard to be able to achieve those goals. So we link this back to our workbook. You know, the next section is around automation and integration, and some of this goes back to how you're going to measure success and be able to link your talent management initiatives to business success. You know, understanding where do you have opportunities for efficiency, you know, with talent management processes that may need to be automated. You know, do you have a suite of technology solution in place? You know, can you, from an integration and from a technical point of view, can you actually share the data you need to be sharing? You know, how are you going to measure success, and do you have the data to measure that success? I think it's a really important, to your point, Steve, as well, to be able to measure that success in terms that are meaningful to the business. It's not, you know, hey, we can reduce our time to hire, which sounds kind of interesting, but it's like, hey, you're going to have less downtime between when people move in and out of the organization. You're going to be more productive. You're going to achieve more of your goals. You know, just that little tweak can be, language can help make people really understand the impact on them. And then also, if you have critical challenges that your current level of automation and integration is not going to be able to help you solve, that builds sort of that burning platform you were talking about, Steve, to be able to say, we've identified this critical problem as an organization, and we simply don't have the right tools in place. So how do we, you know, again, use that as the burning platform to make sure we move in this direction?
You know, a really good way to think about this is starting with similar projects that we've done in the past. Look at how you as an organization have been either successful or failed at implementing a new technology. How did you do it? Where did you start? What did you do? What went well? What did not go well? And learn from those and start to anticipate any sort of roadblocks, right? So we want to start looking at anything that's going to get in our way. We know that the CFO is going to have a particular challenge here. We know that this is going to be an issue. Try to start anticipating some of those showstoppers so we can actually start building a plan to overcome them. We call them roadblocks when we were planning. What are our known roadblocks? And of course, there's going to be what we call potholes that we didn't see coming, but you still go through them anyway, right? So how those can have a significant impact on the success of your program and your project here with talent management. So the more anticipating we can do of those roadblocks and potholes, you're going to be a lot more successful in overcoming them.
I think so much of it comes down to knowing your organization. When it comes to change readiness and understanding how change tolerant or how change ready they are, and also really helping people understand what's in it for them. We talked about the user experience being very different from an admin to an employee to a business leader to a manager. the sort of what's in it for me, why do I want to get behind this initiative, is going to be different. That elevator pitch is going to be different from a business leader champion to a CFO budget holder. It's going to be slightly different because they have different things that they are working towards accomplishing for themselves as well. So I think it's really important to communicate that in ways that are going to be meaningful to the individual, because that's where when people feel that when people really get behind change, is because they feel that it's either going to relieve some pain point they have, or it's just going to be so much better than what they have now that it's worth sustaining the sort of fear and uncertainty that come with change. And so how do you make sure people really understand that value proposition so they're willing to go through and stick with the change?
Yeah, so I think that's critical, right? So the idea of trying to anticipate this, identifying the point of view where they're coming from, but even broader than that, or maybe a little deeper than that, is this notion of identifying your user needs. I've been involved with a lot of procurements, both in the public sector and now in the private sector as well, where you would be really surprised with people that are out on the market looking for a talent management solution and they don't have requirements. They don't have any sort of understanding. Yeah, no understanding of user needs or user requirements. Right. And without that fundamental knowledge, you're not giving yourself a great chance of success in this process, right? Yep. You have to start there. The user needs, user requirements, different users' needs, those types of things have to be your basis that build on your strategy and try to help solve you what is your big pain point, your burning platform.
And we've all been in that situation where the software or technology does exactly what you asked the vendor for it to do, yet what you had no idea what you actually needed, right? And so it's always a disconnect. And that's sort of where we talk about the when and the where. It's sort of how do you understand what you're working towards, and to your point, how do you really understand what those needs are? And I sort of talk about 3 life cycles when we talk about how to think of what your system or your processes need to do. Organizations go through life cycles, and it's not just once. They can continue through this cycle multiple times. Often when things start, they're hyper-growth, they move into stability, there's some disruption and realignment. They grow, and then they might go through another sort of growth spurt, or maybe there's a part of an organization that goes through something new. And I think in the public sector, there's always new projects, there's always new things that are going on. So even if the whole organization might not be going through this life cycle, being aware of what the sort of the growth cycle or stability or sort of what phase of this life cycle you're in is one of the key areas to think about when you're doing those requirements. What is your organization trying to accomplish, and sort of what's it going through in terms of its change tolerance? It can be important. The next one is sort of for lack of a better term, the life cycle. The people, the demographics of the people that are within your organization. People who are new to the organization or new to the workforce. There's again, if it's someone coming up, they may be an individual contributor as well as not yet starting a family. They may be more mobile and willing to take on different assignments than they might at other points in their career. They're planning for responsibilities like children or houses or spouses or travel. And life always throws unplanned responsibilities at us, and again, we grow and we move on to the next project or job, even if it's within the same career. So think about the demographics of the people that you're impacting. If you have a very strong millennial workforce, maybe you want to look at something that has a user interface that's much more mobile and social, things like that. So in addition to where your organization is, where are the people within the organization? And then within the employee life cycle with their relationship with the organization, you're constantly onboarding to whether it's a new job or a new company or a new employer, or even just into new projects. You're learning, you're performing, you're developing, you're moving through the organization. And really it's at the intersection of all these things that you need to be looking for the design for where you really are and who you really have in your organization, to make sure that you're putting together that plan that's going to speak to all those different variables, and that's really going to speak to what your organization needs and who it is that you're trying to sort of bring with you on this change journey.
And I think what you have an understanding for those different components, the organization life and employee life cycle, you can start to build the business case a lot stronger, because you're able to start incorporating stuff like return on investment. Right. So if we take a look, that's often called ROI, return on investment plan, before we even go ask for funding on this, what is it that if you spend this amount of money, we're going to be able to do differently, better, faster, right? So it's idea of clearly I messed up the word articulating. How ironic is that? Clearly articulating and quantifying the value that you're going to get as a result of this initiative, right? So how can we actually do that? It's got to be outcome-based. It may also have some direct and indirect, right? So reduced costs or better employee engagement. Those may be outcomes in return on investment, but they're not necessarily easy to quantify, right? So what we're trying to do is making sure that we're giving a reason to buy, right? So if you're not the decision maker and you're building the business case for the person that will be or people that will be, right, start including this component of ROI. If you spend this, this is what you will get. And this is where it addresses you in your life cycle.
And that's where that balance between sort of the efficiency and effectiveness and then the sort of top line growth, because people will be more productive or they're less likely to leave. There's the risk and opportunity costs that you're avoiding, which is really hard to quantify. But I think there's always room for both. Think about onboarding, the difference between paper and electronic documents and having to store things like those start to be things that you can quantify from a financial perspective, as well as then the sort of harder to quantify, experience of the new candidate. So absolutely, you have to be thinking about all these perspectives when you're thinking about putting together your business plan. And really, it's important to remember too, talent data is used throughout the process. So we're using it for building teams, we're using it for forecasting, we're using it for evaluating learning, engagement, building recruiting plans, identifying successors and high potential. So it's throughout the life cycle of the individual and throughout the needs of the organization that we're using talent data. And I think it's really important because one of the things that data and solutions and technology help us do in a unified way is to give us a unified language to talk about some of these things. If we're using the same sort of criteria and the same rating scale, if you will, to talk to people when they are coming into the organization, when they're being developed in the organization, when they're planning for succession, it really helps people see how they can build and grow, and you have a sort of database decision-making capability that you're able to use to make sure that employers and employees and one boss to the next really have a common understanding of what you mean when you talk about certain skills or when you talk about evaluating talent and moving it through your organization as well. So that brings us to the why, and I think we've already talked a fair amount about this, but I think it's again, it's how do you articulate in that language? How do you make sure that people understand why the challenge is so important and what there is to be gained by solving it? And I think what it comes down to is also it's not ever just a tool change, as we mentioned. It's really a culture change. And I love this quote about culture. Cults about culture, that's not good. But it's a set of behaviors that are rewarded or discouraged by the people, processes, and systems. And I always believe that you can't, I would say you can diagnose culture, you can't prescribe it. You can sort of, it exists already whether you've been consciously curating it or not, because people are, rewarding and encouraging different behaviors and processes and systems. And so really make sure you have that common vision of where you're going and making sure that if your culture is not supportive of that, you find ways to either, so deny oxygen to the culture that's not serving your needs, or to let it flourish if it is serving your needs. So it's like, how do we make sure we are getting that set of behaviors that are being sort of rewarded by all of our systems, all of our practices, all of our technology, so that we actually are getting the outcomes that we're looking for.
And I also think culture plays a very important part in how we actually communicate this change, right? So I think there's some tenets that go along with good talent management strategies and projects. Some of them are transparency, clearly communicating, right? Clear, honest, making sure that there's no hidden agenda or hidden motive or why you're doing this. You want to be as transparent and open, as honest and inclusive in this process as well, right? So as we're going through this process and as we're starting to step up the plans for this, let's say we are building our business case, we're getting close to approval, we need to start pulling people into the project so we get different points of view, right? So that ability to reach out to individuals and be open and share is a fundamental part of talent management and this implementation of this process, and I think that's fed by culture.
I think it's also too, it's really common for organizations to not view talent as a universal resource. You hear about talent hoarding, or teams that really stay intact and don't move talent around. And I think this idea of, from a cultural perspective and from a technology perspective and from a systems perspective, how do we give people the opportunity to grow by showing them the full breadth of what the opportunities are within the organization? And how do we give managers the comfort to know that moving talent through their organization is going to be good, because you'd rather keep someone within the organization even if they have moved beyond sort of the job role on your team. And I think that's a really critical challenge for a lot of organizations, to be able to have that culture of moving talent up and in and around the organization. I always say, when people ask me what's the key metric that you should look at for HR, I always say movement, because if you trust in your systems, you know that if you move someone into a new role, your organization is going to be able to find you someone, either internally or externally, to backfill the role that you moved out of. So it's trust in each other and in your systems to be able to curate talent in that way.
Unfortunately, oftentimes in the public sector and government, specifically in my history, what we've seen is, if we allow for that to happen, the departing, or the manager that they're leaving and that position that they're leaving often gets cut. We don't get to fill it, those types of things. So you have to have the trust from your top leadership to know that, hey, if we allow our employees mobility and allow them to do different things, we're not going to get burned in the process.
And that's really where the measures and the sort of higher level organizational conversation needs to happen, because to be able to say, I can deliver you these benefits from unified talent management, but I need you to support me in the fact that we're going to be having to move people, or mobility is going to be part of it. I think that's a really key point, to be able to say there's different, the ask is different from some of those champions and some of those people who are going to be able to make some of those structural and organizational changes that are going to support the technology changes as well. And so we come back to some of these questions about, what are these critical problems, and when you ask yourself where you can begin, and how you can define what you're going after, think about, are you struggling to connect talent processes? Are you losing high performers? Do you have talent data all over your organization? Do you have inconsistency? One of my favorite quotes is, inconsistency is the hallmark of mediocrity. How do you make sure that you have this, these processes that are going to actually get you where you're going and have it defined? So when you're trying to articulate and ask yourself, why are we going after this? Some of these questions can be helpful to start that conversation and really understand, is it about connecting data? Is it about retention? What's really our goal, and where can we start first? Take that first step that's going to be meaningful, get some of that low-hanging fruit as we move forward and build the business case as well.
One of the biggest obstacles in talent management and bringing unified talent management together into an organization is that it's a lot of work. There's a lot of different things going on. So it's important to make sure that you actually are planning for the future. Number one, realize that you're not going to get everything tomorrow, right? So there's a church by Winston Churchill, my favorite quote, said, perfection is the enemy of progress, right? So if you wait until everything is perfect and the environment is perfect, you're never going to make any progress. The idea here, and I guess what we're saying is, pick an area to start and start there, because you have to start somewhere and you grow it. So that also speaks to, even if you're beginning the project or the program and deploying it, you should have a roadmap. Okay, so in this year we're going to be implementing succession planning, and next year we're going to talk about learning. We're going to talk about that in the second quarter. Build that plan and make sure that that's communicated across the board.
And it's so important, because when people have different, even if they know that their part that they care most passionately about is coming, they're a lot more willing to support you in the near term, because they can see that path and have that visibility.
The other thing that talent management, this concept of unified talent management, is we're now arguing that the talent management solution should be in one system, meaning that people that didn't have to play together before now have to play together. So that might be our HR folks who are doing performance or recruiting and onboarding, and they never touch learning. They never touch any of that. When we start talking about these types of discussions and these types of interdependencies of talent management indicators and data points, you have to have everyone on the same table making the decisions, because it affects everybody.
Absolutely. And again, setting me up for success here when we think about those challenges and when it comes to stakeholders is, thinking about the change that may be required and who's going to be impacted and how you build out that communication plan. Who do you need on board, through all the different parts of the organizations. There's groups of stakeholders, there's individual stakeholders, and really making sure that from the beginning you have that as part of the plan. I think that we can't emphasize that enough. Tying it to business results, tying it to a business pain point, and really making sure that it's very clear to everyone what their role is and how it's going to benefit them so that you can make sure that they're on board.
And making sure that you're taking a look at what you've done in the past, right? So there's no better predictor of future behavior than what we've done in the past, right? So how did we communicate this? How did we get change? And who was the early adopter? How did they roll it out? How did they get them involved? And learn from the past.
Yep, absolutely. And just a few more slides. I know we want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, but just the last piece is sort of the how. And we've been talking about this all along. Maybe we can sort of put a bow on it and bring it together. It's designing. We talked about understanding where you are, but then also when you look forward, what is it that you need? Because some of it may be a shift in terms of talent that you can either grow people into or may have to hire. But particularly when we talk about retention, how do you, if you need to, get from here to there when it may come to skills or capabilities of your talent. So looking at, where do you need to go, understanding that there's multiple drivers of value. You talked about ROI, but there's lots of different ways. You can talk about top line, impact, bottom line, and risk avoidance. There's all these different ways to articulate the value. So making sure you understand who's involved in the change, where the future goal is, and how you're going to articulate the value along the way. And then, it just comes down to communicate, communicate, communicate. My favorite quote on communication is, I think it was Shaw who said, the biggest illusion in communication, or the biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has occurred. So I think it can't be said enough that once you articulate that value proposition, once you understand who you need to be talking to, really the job is to say it over and over and over again to make sure everyone is absolutely clear on what needs to happen and why things are going forward, to make sure you keep that support.
And do it in multiple modalities, right? Don't think that just an email is going to cover it.
Never.
Or the poster in the hall is going to cover it.
Yeah, we've actually done some research that looks at the more modalities organizations use, the sort of more change readiness, the speed of change is accelerated because people all learn and hear in different ways. So it's not only the message needs to be tuned into particular individuals or groups, but the method that message is delivered in needs to be tuned in as well. So there's a lot. This isn't easy. I always say I'm lucky enough that I get to write about HR. I don't have to do it every day because it's a really hard job you all do. And the listeners that are on the call here today, we know it's challenging, but hopefully we can arm you with some tools to help you, face that challenge. So we'll just leave you with a couple of last things, some ideas for building the plan, making sure that the case for the time and the money and the resources are going to balance that business impact or that organizational impact, and bringing together all these needs and stakeholders and prioritize what's first and how to approach it. It's a big project if you're sort of going from where you are today to a unified solution. It can be a big project, but being able to sequence it and decide what's important first and get some of those quick wins can really help you along the way as well. And so lastly, we'll just leave you with a couple of keys to success, and you may have some other thoughts on this too, Steve, from your experience, but empowering managers, because they have so much influence and they are at that point of translation within an organization from vision to day-to-day execution, making sure they have the tools that they can track and manage and communicate around where things are going right and wrong, making sure there's visibility, and again, making sure that it's communicated. Things that may seem obvious to you may not be to other people, so making sure you're communicating in those multiple modalities. And really helping people develop when it comes to retention. And that's really one of the main goals of having a unified solution, is to be able to make sure your high performers get the challenges they need, your organization builds the skills that it needs, helps people transition from one set of skills or capabilities to another as the organization grows. So a lot of, yeah, go ahead.
I would also say that be mindful of building your team and who's on that, right? So as you're building your team, make sure that you're pulling people in. I don't want you to be seen as, oh, HR is back again and they're trying to do this talent management
HR,
thing.
I'm here to help.
Yeah. So making sure that you're including people from all different viewpoints, right? So internal to HR, across the different modules, performance learning, succession, compensation, whatever modules you're looking at deploying it under talent management, but also outside in the business. I think what happens a lot of times, those people that are brought into the actual process then take ownership and are able to help you tell your story as you're continuing to roll this out. Just really good, sound change management advice. Build in the people that you suspect are going to be obstacles and make them part of the team and help them help you. It really is really effective. And I've even seen some organizations be, and this sounds crazy, but I've even seen successful talent management initiatives where we include the different unions, the bargaining units that are part of the work, but often aren't involved or given a voice in the actual process, right? And I think that that's based on your organization, your relationship, your transparency, your willingness to be negotiating with the bargaining units and unions, but I've seen it be really successful on the long haul.
Yeah, and they really, like every group or individual, they want to be seen and heard. And so involving them in the conversation can go so far, even if their priorities aren't the first one you go after. You know, to our point earlier, if they can see that the end game, the overall path is something that's going to be beneficial, they can see how their needs have been heard and reflected in the plan, that can go a really long way. And again, every situation is different, every organization is different, but this idea of bringing people in and really making them feel seen and heard, a much better chance of getting them on board, even if their priority isn't the first thing you're going after. So, I think with that, we may have a question or two, and we'll answer those. And if there's any we don't get to, obviously we'll contact you afterwards. But Dawn, I think take it away.
Thanks, Molly. So it is Q&A time. So as a reminder, if you have any questions, please go ahead and submit those in the Q&A module on the right side of the screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So our first question, given the reductions in funding for agencies that impact their mission accomplishment efforts, how can we expect agencies to begin their journey to unified talent management?
That's a great question, and it's something that you're going to have to factor into your business case. I will tell you that if you don't do it now, you're going to have to do it sooner or later. I want to use an example, and this is my former agency, the IRS, who was in the news recently and cited as they have the oldest IT system in government, and that system in government is the system that they use to process our taxes. And it's about 58 years old. And what's happened is that they haven't been able or willing to fund the change that is needed for, it's called the IMF, the Business Master File in the, I forget what the IMF stands for, but anyway, it's how they process and store their taxes. So by putting that off, they're now in a spot where it's costing them more to maintain this, where they don't have the ability to innovate and update. So now they're spending more on maintenance of this old 60-year-old machine system because they haven't been able to win the case for implementation of a newer system that would solve these problems. So I think it's going to happen sooner or later. It's just whether or not you're able to build all the facts that you need that are going to be convincing to the right people.
And I think it's so true. When you always end up paying for paying for upgrades, so to speak, sooner or later, and sometimes in more and less painful ways. But I think it's also, you know, if you're not thinking about retention now, not only from a systems perspective, but we're talking so much about the tight labor market, and people who don't think about retention now are going to really regret it next year because it'll be maybe too late for them to be thinking about retention. They may have lost great talent. So I think it's, again, building that case to how do you get out ahead of it, because it will come back to rear its head. There's studies in the last economic downturn when people let so many people go, those that were able to hold on to more of their staff actually were able to rebound more quickly. So this idea of making sure you're holding on to the right people and really making sure that you understand the implications if you choose not to invest now, that's a choice as well. It's not just, the choice isn't just to implement something like this, but you're making a distinct choice if you choose not to move forward as well. And so making sure people really understand the implications of that choice as well.
And that's got to be part of your business plan too, your business case as well, right? The cost for not doing it, right? So we want to do this for all the right reasons, but we also want to avoid these negative things that are going to be bad for us. Retention, low engagement, people not feeling the love, taking their jobs elsewhere. So it's important. include
Even
it
your
in
employer brand as a public sector organization. You know, every employer has a brand. Do you want to be known as a place where people can get unique experiences, or do you want to be known as a place where, you know, you're behind the times? I think it's, you know, there's always choices when we consider these things.
Well, this has been really fun, Molly.
Yeah, it has been. Hope everyone has enjoyed it.
Yeah, and as Molly mentioned, everyone on today's call will be receiving an email with a copy of the report and the workbook, as well as the recording, to help you all get started on your journey to unified talent management. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Molly. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.